Welcome everyone to the final session of Clarkson University's Introduction to Semiconductor Series. And I'm Fram. I've been your host all along. So I doubt that I need any introduction. But today we have a special session of what I'm calling Brothers Talking Tech. I've invited two of my most esteemed colleagues from the semiconductor industry. And we've even ensured that as we've arranged the videos on here, that we've gone in order of age, importance, arguably in order of how much mom and dad loved each one of us. So with that, I'm going to start maybe and let Greg. You can do the first introduction. Uh,
Thank you, Fram. He's always very generous. My name's Greg Aii. As Fram indicated, I'm the oldest by 19 minutes. So not much of a lead over Geoff. But it's certainly a pleasure to be with you in this seminar series for another Brothers Talking Tech. Class of 82, Chemi from Clarkson, so a proud alum of Clarkson. And that whole time, 43 years in the semiconductor industry. So it's a real pleasure to be with you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Geoff, as you know, Greg's twin brother, Fram's older and more intelligent brother. Sorry.
we'll get to
you
that.
guys have gotten to know Fram over the course of the seminar, at least a little bit. So I don't really need to describe him. Greg, we call the nice IE. He's really the guy that everyone goes to and everyone loves Greg. I'm the fun IE. So that's why I'm here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But, you can notice Greg and Fram are both wearing Clarkson apparel. And I didn't find any apparel in the closet. So I thought what I would do is put the Zoom background up. And this is from, believe it or not, a student directory that was issued. I'll show you the full cover here in a second. In 1980, each year they would issue it. And essentially in it had the names of every student, their address on campus, and their home address, as well as phone numbers, believe it or not. In this day of data protection, it's really funny. And I was reminiscing with Greg. I'd say at least half, maybe more of the people in that picture I still recognize from that 40-some years ago. But that's my contribution to the Clarkson alumni. Also 82 Chemi, and actually roommates with Greg.
Roommates.
Runs to be 310.
That's right.
310.
And Geoff, maybe describe what you've been doing for 40 years other than, quote, having fun.
That's okay. Again, all three of us started our careers with IBM. And, when people talk about getting jobs, the year we graduated, 82, chemies were not getting jobs in the chemical process industry. People were laying off in oil and CP. But IBM was hiring. In the year we graduated, both IBM and GE hired more engineers from Clarkson than any other school in the country. And IBM in particular was ramping up their semiconductor production. And so Greg and I interviewed all different companies except one, IBM, and we both started working there in 1982. And so my career has been very similar. It's been semiconductors that whole time, many different areas, everything from microprocessor design to R&D, headquarters, capital, certainly fab. I left I left IBM to go to GlobalFoundries when they were formed, and then was in charge of bringing my old friends from IBM into GlobalFoundries, my new friends. I now am in Hoya, a Japanese company, which supplies many of the key elements for not just semiconductors, but flat panel displays, hard disk drives, and a lot of optical assemblies. So that's also been interesting for me.
I'm going to fire it back over to Greg because I also want him to do a kind of a quick employment.
Sure. As Geoff indicated, came out of Clarkson in 82, depth of the recession, but was fortunate enough to start in Burlington, Vermont, in the wafer fab. There at the time, we were just migrating from 100 millimeter diameter wafers to 125 millimeter diameter wafers, doing 2-micron critical dimension devices, and working on 64K DRAM chips. So really the majority of all of my career, really, essentially, it has been in wafer fab, IBM for 32 years, including the last 2 years in a 450 millimeter wafer consortium in Albany at the Nanotech campus in Albany, New York. And then I joined GlobalFoundries in 2014 as a director of quality. In my current role, I have a global team. It's called Global Reliability. So we do technology qualifications and ongoing monitoring of semiconductor technologies globally. So I have teams in Singapore, Germany, Bulgaria, and the US. And that's been something that's really kept me going and really exciting to have a global team similar to obviously as Geoff in his role, really being able to work with people around the globe.
So, to your question or your comment, Geoff, about you being the smart one, we actually
Fun first. Fun first.
Fun first, then smart. We actually had a question come in. You won't see it in the chat. It got sent to me via the Signal platform. But the question that came in was, given we all went to Clarkson, which one of the three of us had the highest GPA?
Was that from Janine that said she had a Signal?
To be fair, it was Fram, but then
It was
again,
Fram. It was Fram. But again, he was a double E, what can we say?
Okay, just wanted to make sure we got that out there.
We got that
Fram
out.
had the highest GPA.
Moving right along.
Okay, we'll move right along past that. So, all right. Yeah, this has been by the way, great semester-long series. We've touched on a lot of areas, and so I thought we would just kind of do almost like a recap of some of the areas that we talked about and just banter them around. And so, and as we three of us have talked about the last 3 months, wow, right? I mean, unbelievable. Uh, the things that have happened over the last 3 months. And someone, by the way, was asking what your majors were, and both of them were chemical engineers. Unfortunately, they weren't quite smart enough to get into the double E discipline, so they decided to slough off a little and just kind of cruise through on chemical engineering. So,
by the way, that's something that I when I speak to universities a lot,
yeah,
it's been somewhat of a bias over the years, in that as the semiconductor industry initially started, most semiconductor related coursework at universities was out of the double E department. And so non-double E's would often say, well, I didn't have any coursework or very little exposure to semiconductor, even semiconductor processing. And I think that's been a key change over the years, is that now more and more non-electrical engineers realize that the industry is really dependent on, multidisciplinary. But essentially, if you work in a fab, the number one major we hire is chemical engineers, because
that's a
process
great point.
to manufacture semiconductors is essentially one chemical process after another. And so I think that's been one of the good things I've been trying to get the message out, is that it's not just a double E thing, right? The industry is really a very multidisciplinary industry.
Yeah, by the way, maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about workforce needs and kind of hiring in the industry, because on one hand, just about every exec that I talked with this semester talked about, we've got these hiring needs and we're going to need more people in this industry, particularly if we're planning on growing it from the 600 billion we're at today to 1 trillion. So that's kind of what I call the long-term perspective in terms of more workforce needed. But if you talk to anyone who's sort of on the ground today, students and even professionals, they're hearing a very different story, right? And so, one comment I guess I'll make, and then you folks can also pipe in here, is while there's this long-term growth trend, the industry is also very cyclical. And to a certain extent, right now, it's kind of in one of its down cycles, right? And that certainly impacts hiring. And then, of course, with some of the real tactical stuff around tariffs and some of the geopolitics, that's also tended to freeze some folks as well. But maybe I'll go over to you, Geoff, and then Greg, you can make some comments here as well around tactical hiring in this industry.
Yeah, let me step back for 1 second because the big picture here is very important. And when you get old like us, you kind of have this longitudinal view. So we started about 40 years ago. I want to take you to 40 years before that. What's 4 years before that? World War II kind of time frame. And the reason that's important is a lot of technological push happens in times of turmoil. So if you look at operations research, supply chain, what we call supply chain today, was really pushed and refined and enhanced because of the needs of World War II. Same thing for things like radar and communication and crypto. The cryptos of today came about because of the ciphers that were developed to have encrypted messages, right? And of course, the cell phone systems and all those were from that. So the reason I bring that up is you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. No one kind of called this AI, no one in general. When we were chemies, they didn't even offer, as Greg mentioned, really semiconductor process. Very few schools like Stanford, USA, but certainly not Clarkson and not many other engineering schools. Yet we both made long careers in semiconductor. Many times students, especially undergrads coming out, kind of think, well, I studied this and therefore I should find a job doing this. Even if they do, they probably will not do that for the rest of their lives. So for me, the hiring is develop skills. Make sure you're looking at that big picture as well as your own situation. And flexibility. Flexibility comes in lots of ways. You got to look at different segments, what's growing. Growth is always a big place you want to focus on. And whether it's the fab or EDA or the different things you've talked about, Fram. Geography is very different. I can point to both Greg and Fram to some extent, have worked in many different places. I've been to several countries, especially with IBM. I now manage a Japanese company from Vermont and Florida, where I live in the US, thanks to remote, which has helped a lot. But flexibility would be key. And when I used to mentor younger people, I told them, look, the first rule of mentoring, know yourself. And people, well, I know myself. No, you don't. You know what you think you want, but are you willing to do what it takes to get to the goals that you're setting for yourself? Everyone wants to be a VP, right? Are you willing to put in the hours, move when you need to, go live in a foreign country, work for a boss you don't like? There's a list of things that you'll have to do. So from a workforce development, I think if you're the student, flexibility. From the company, you're looking for people who have skills and the right attitude. It's not just what's on that resume anymore. What you bring to the horizontal collaboration skills. The way I describe it, I always like to hire people who have played team sports because you know how to win and lose. You know how to be on a team, things like that. Also important. And nowadays, you got to know how to get your resume through the AI screens. So whether you like it, there's a pragmatic side to all this.
Yeah. And Greg, when you comment too, maybe because I know you do a lot of work with software folks and in particular, maybe comment about that segment.
Sure. No, it's an evolving landscape. I certainly agree with everything that Geoff said. I think very well stated. I think on the software side, we can't ignore the impact that AI is having, particularly on early career hiring in the software space. I think it's important to recognize that AI for the students, right, will be a major tool in the toolkit going forward. And I think companies in particular are being very conservative on their hiring in the software space because they really do expect that the next 5 years will be quite disruptive in terms of how software, for example, GitHub, 60% of the code on GitHub today is AI generated. Companies look at that and say, well, we need to then think about our hiring needs, for example, in the software space. So if you're a computer science or software major, you need to think about, again, applicability, flexibility. How much do you know about database architectures? How much do you know about adjacent areas where domains that you could apply your skills into. Because I do believe, as I said, in the next 5 years, we're going to see a major reset in terms of the number of pure programmers that are going to be needed for any given application. On the industry side, broader industry, semiconductor industry, I think the hiring is going to be cyclical. And I think one of the ways you can differentiate yourself certainly is attitude and flexibility. But again, don't lock yourself into thinking that there has to be this exact match. Our industry really welcomes technical, analytical minds. And it's really less about sometimes the specifics of any particular coursework you may have taken. Certainly flexibility around where you're willing to work, including globally, right?
Yeah, I think, when I think, agree with all these comments, and specifically in the context of some of the segments we looked at in this course, the EDA segment, particularly for software folks, I think right now still has some robust hiring needs, right? So we talked obviously with Raja, who we all know from Synopsys, but you have Cadence, you have Siemens, other folks in that space, and even on the IP side, development, right? People
Absolutely.
like ARM, right?
Yep. The fabless design
And the
companies are
fabless
still
design
very
shops themselves, right?
interested.
Versus, um,
Well, another very emerging trend right now is that the larger systems guys are forming their own chip divisions. So
mhm,
Google, Apple, Microsoft,
mhm,
General Motors is
mhm.
starting up a major division to bring in-house the design of semiconductors. And so again, that affords opportunities, right, for graduates. So thinking outside of the traditional uh, only just foundries and maybe the very well-known fabless design companies. There's also a broader interest in semiconductor design related skills emerging for these larger players.
Well, good. Let's kind of stay in this whole arena, I guess, of geopolitics. And geez, where do we start? Tariffs. What's uh,
I think like any industry, and certainly history can guide us here, the worst part about tariffs aren't the tariffs themselves sometimes, but the uncertainty around them.
mhm,
How are they being applied? Inconsistent or arbitrary? If they're seen as arbitrary, if they're on one day and they're off the next, that is very disruptive, particularly for the semiconductor industry, where long lead times, very large capital investments required. Uh, this flies in the face of sort of spur of the moment decisions, right? Because you're looking at multi-year investment, multi-year bring up of manufacturing facilities. And so very challenging environment for the semiconductor industry over the last 3 months.
I look at that. I agree with what Greg said, but I also see it as a time. There have been times in the semiconductor industry where things have transformed. Again, in the 80s, who was king? Japan. Intel almost went out of business. The 64K that Greg worked on was actually an Intel design that Intel paid for, or IBM paid Intel for to give him money. And then we also gave him an EDA system. So who knew? And then Intel became the powerhouse, and IBM got out of semiconductors. Now Intel's back again. So there are times of these transitions, and it's messy. It is not clean. Everyone likes clean, predictable. No doubt that stability helps. But there are also opportunities that come up in these cases, and you kind of have to try to figure out, although it's not easy, and you're not going to be sure. You need to try to figure out what will be the state after this. If these things stay this way, could there be a different end state than there is today in different direction? I'll give you the example. Japan is nowhere in semiconductors. They're pouring money in Rapidus and some others trying to get back in, where they were the king. It took about 20 years to lose this formula. USA became strong. Korea became strong. China's coming strong. And so you got to think, in my mind, in 10, 20-year chunks and then kind of work back. There's no doubt the current environment is quite challenging. Right? We're all dealing with it daily. It's a detail kind of thing. I'll give you an example. There's these tariffs. You'll read about that. Except you got to find which schedule you're on. Oh, and by the way, there's some exceptions to that schedule. And are you included or not? And sometimes the language isn't even clear if you're exempt or included or what it is. So that's the uncertainty Greg's talking about, which just drives people crazy and can be inefficient. If you really want to have the chess master view and think, several moves ahead, that will help you try to keep your eyes on where can this all lead and how can I use
Sure.
that.
I think it's safe to say that the current administration is at least committed to at, at some level of improving or increasing domestic semiconductor production. And, I think the big projects are moving forward, right? In TSMC in Arizona, Samsung in Texas, Intel in Ohio is on delay. But so I think, again, being flexible, and if you have a preference for working in the United States, well, you may have to make some sacrifices in terms of where. If you're available globally, willing to work globally, there is still tremendous opportunity for expat work or Americans working abroad in the semiconductor industry. And even in spite of everything you've heard here in terms of what tariffs have done, there's very much a global industry.
And it's not just technical people. I think Fram, Professor McKinnon, Bill, who
Yeah.
I've hosted him in Singapore. He's gone to GlobalFoundries in Singapore under Greg, and in Malaysia. He's got a range of students, and there are things like dealing with the taxes across global enterprises,
Mhm.
having expertise in American export controls or regulations. Um, there's all kinds of things that if you look at whether it's the tariffs or geopolitical or whatever it is, the flexibility, but also looking for the opportunities. There are opportunities there. You got to find them. You got to compete for them. It might be tough. It's not going to be silver platter. Um, and remember, you're smart. You probably graduated high up in your class, and then you went to Clarkson. You were with a bunch of smart people, and maybe you did well there. And now you're gonna start all over again. You're the newbie now, if you're graduating, right? And now you got people with more experience, and we're also really smart. Who've already been weeded out, just like you've already survived. They've already gone through that and gone beyond that. So just keep that in mind, but don't get discouraged because your turn will come. You just need to keep mining it.
Yeah, it's been interesting the experience from the semester talking with the various executives. And most of them are treating I'll call it the tariff stuff as kind of short-term bumps that aren't necessarily changing their long-term view around capital expansion. And because they're making tens of billions of dollars of kind of decisions and they're looking at long-term supply demand, et cetera. And they're doing some tactical adjustments based on what's happening. But you bring up a great point, which will be one, to me, how long this period is going to last, because the longer it lasts, you can't just treat it as little tactical adjustments. And then I think the great point you brought up, Geoff, right, which is if it drives us to a different end state that might have, not occurred because of it, then, and by the way, this industry, right, has always been around people who had vision and invested when things are the lowest because of the cycle time. And there's tons of examples of people who killed it, getting it right, and people who got killed getting it wrong.
Exactly. So get it right, guys.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, and yeah, I mean, we'll see with with the CHIPS Act, and what, might come as a result of that, if there'll be some sort of, you know, future there, et cetera. So,
You
Yeah,
also have to
again,
look at the
it's
markets,
still
right?
uncertain with
yeah.
the current Commerce Secretary really has not given additional guidance yet, even on the committed payments that were made. in the prior administration. So there's still a lot of uncertainty there. One area, though, of the CHIPS Act that I think is really encouraging as well for students is it's not just the high-profile fabs, but the ecosystem around the fabs.
Mhm.
So Secretary Raimondo, former Secretary of Commerce Raimondo, she was really a keen advocate to include in the CHIPS Act substantial investment in American ecosystem for high purity materials, for example. So new raw wafer facility coming online in Missouri, high purity chemicals and gas production sites in the US, long overdue. And so again, for students looking for opportunities, don't just look at the sort of the marquee names. There's a whole ecosystem that feeds the semiconductor industry with high purity materials and other essential elements, right? I know you had a number of speakers from the equipment manufacturers, right?
Mark Doherty.
Mark
Yeah,
Doherty, exactly, right?
former fab guy.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, don't just look at fabs get most of the attention, right? Because of the big ticket item they are, right? $20 billion investment. That's what gets all the headlines. But it takes a whole ecosystem around it to produce the semiconductor. And so that's also another valuable space, I think, for graduates to look at for opportunities.
I'm a good example of that. Essentially, what I manage is ecosystem pieces.
Yeah.
And so,
Greg,
again, I was in fab, I was in design. Now I'm in the ecosystem.
Greg, question for you. Do you have a bunny suit with your name on it?
I did when I wore a younger man's clothes.
Yeah. I
Oh,
told
now
you.
we're going. Now
I would have responded differently.
are we channeling Billy Joel now?
Yeah.
Didn't Billy? Is there? I don't know if this is true or not. Didn't Billy Joel come on campus one year
He
at
did.
Clarkson?
He
Yes,
did.
in the late 70s.
In the late 70s, he
Yes,
did a concert at
he did a
Clarkson.
concert at Clarkson.
Wow,
Yes.
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah, this flexibility, the diversification of demand. Fram, you're an expert at this as well, right? There's been different eras. The PCs, then went to cell phones. Now data centers, one of my key customer drivers, the automotive, IoT. As the demand drivers have shifted and changed, the old ones are still there with the new growth areas. That plays into what Greg said, which is you have some of those which drive really leading edge, 5, 3, 2 going on nanometers, and others which are, I hate calling them lagging edge, but more mature technologies that have maybe special features, gallium nitride, silicon carbide spins on silicon, or even just plain 28 nanometer CMOS, right?
Mhm.
I think you should talk about that a little bit because that's another one of these longer term, where the
That's a good point. I mean, GaN on silicon has been a disruptor for the industry, right? Historically, so this technology, these so-called compound semiconductor technologies, support higher voltage applications. So with the advent and adoption of EVs, there's a need for semiconductor devices that can withstand, 650 or 1,000 volts, to be either in the vehicle or in charger stations. And
Let's talk about cell phones, Fran. What year did you start at Qualcomm?
I started at Qualcomm in 2005, so 20 years ago.
Which is well into the cell phone ramp.
Uh, yeah, but it wasn't quite a smartphone,
yeah, there's
era.
not no mobile broadband yet.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of came with 3G, was sort of the advent of mobile broadband and apps on the smartphone. In fact, this Thursday, I'm chairing a little webinar on 6G. So
Yeah,
that's out on my LinkedIn. But I want to,
But when you first joined, what was the kind of technology that was being used in, the phones?
yeah, the phone technology, it was interesting because just as I joined, that was when Qualcomm had made the decision from going with whatever you want to call it, lagging edge or mature technology. So up until then, Qualcomm would always be a follower to a company like Xilinx, for example, who always was on the cutting edge, right? The FPGA folks, Xilinx and Altera, were the ones who were really driving the technology hard. And Qualcomm would typically come in later after, the defect density had been driven down and the yield and the cost, everything, and just kind of, use mature technologies. the thing that changed it is with the smartphone. So for the first time, you really needed a high performance processor inside of that cell phone, and you couldn't do it with the older technologies. So just as I joined, the first technology that Qualcomm decided they were going to be on, close to the leading edge was 65 nanometer, right? And so there was this big project around getting, on 65 nanometer, and it sort of had to change everything because now all of a sudden, right, you're dealing with all this stuff on the leading edge of the technology, like defect density learning and going through all that stuff. And of course, from there, they continued on moving forward, including a lot of product engineering work done by Mike Campbell, who was a guest early in the semester. And Mike Campbell,
Another Clarkson grad.
Another
another
Clarkson grad,
Clarkson grad,
Ormsby 3. Ormsby 3.
and Ormsby
Right.
3. He was on the same floor as both of you guys
That's
during
right.
your era at Clarkson. So, and yeah, it's true. A couple other points I was going to make too. You talk about the ecosystem. Christine Dunbar last week talked about this with the 52 billion in the CHIPS Act. 39 billion is kind of targeted towards that CapEx expansion, et cetera. And the other roughly 12 or 11, 12 billion is towards research, next generation stuff, et cetera. And of course, at NatCast, she said of those 12 billion, they're focused on about 6 billion, of that. But it's a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. The other thing
And
she
then
also
advanced
talked,
packaging.
yeah, advanced
Right?
packaging, which we'll get to.
Huge area. As the price of silicon has
Yeah.
grown exponentially for these leading edge nodes, there's been tremendous investment and interest in expanding the innovation around advanced packaging because it is a
Yeah.
way
I'm laughing because while
learning.
Greg started in the fab, I started in packaging. And so packaging at that time, IBM was very non-standard, very. And the industry had these wire bonded to the chip and plastic encapsulated packages. IBM was ceramic, collapse, controlled collapse, solder, C4s, right? And so I laugh now because, again, I work in a
It's back
company
to the
that's
future.
involved with glass substrates.
IBM's thermal cooled module,
Oh, yeah, exactly.
multi-layer
And
ceramic
the reason
water.
that I'm laughing is
Yeah.
today, things graduate from like that plastic to then they had silicon interposers, which some people are using now in very complicated things. They're moving towards other types of interposers, but they want to get to is a glass interposer because dielectric constant and better conductivity. And because I'm a glass company, we deal with these people. What's
Okay,
really
here,
funny
hold on. Trivia
is,
question, because
yeah,
Christine and I had to look this up. Actually, someone looked it up for us last week. What the C4,
Yes.
what does that complete thing stand for?
control collapse,
Perhaps
control
chip
collapse.
connection.
Yeah, chip connection.
There you
Yeah.
go. You always listen.
Oh,
See, this is why he's the oldest and
no, no,
wisest.
but you're talking to the wrong ones. We
No,
knew both Paul Farr Sr.,
C4.
who was one of the patent holders, and his son Paul, who was your neighbor friend.
Yeah,
So
that's right. That's
that's
right.
right.
Yep.
But the point I was going to make is what is old is new again. So you talk about the TCM, but what really made the TCM work, other than the thermal part of it, was a very complicated, complex, and sophisticated multi-level ceramic. And they had many levels and tungsten filling, and Fishkill lived on this thing forever. And that's what the very high speed bipolar chips that were in the IBM mainframes lived on. Then that wasn't good enough. And they went to polyimide and fine line copper deposition on top of the ceramic. And they had several layers of polyimide. What really killed it though, and then they had thermal conduction pistons with water cooling, and it was
No.
just this huge, expensive thing.
Do
What
you
killed it?
remember? Do you remember like when the if the water got shut off,
Yeah,
the warning sign that would come on the IBM systems that said,
no.
the water, due to water shortage or, water's been shut off, systems would start heating up and they'd say systems are going to shut down because of lack of water.
There you go.
Yeah.
But what killed it was, and Greg's very familiar with this, IBM used to make the really high-speed bipolar chips. And the limitation was, while they were very fast, they were very hot, and they were limited in the number of circuits you could pack on it, which drove a lot of I/O from every chip. And that's why you need the multi-level ceramic. No one believed that CMOS would eventually be good enough to do processors. What they didn't count on is that even though CMOS didn't have the drive and the raw performance of a bipolar, you could fit a lot of circuits. And though the design piece now, a lot of parallelism and different microprocessor architectures, said I could do this a couple chips. I don't need this fancy, expensive packaging anymore. I can go to, simpler things, which have now over time, because the function's grown up, they got to go back to more complex. So there's these cycles of technology. But that one thing, moving from a bipolar chip to CMOS, which some people saw coming and some people fought against, changed the world for IBM and for others as well.
Yeah, that was my very first project out of school. It was the old RAMDAC chip, and I was asked, did I want to serve on the CMOS design team or the bipolar design team? They ran parallel teams to see who was going to win, and I said, "Oh, CMOS sounds like the future. Let's get on that one." And lo and behold. So you asked about
okay, one thing though on that thought.
Yeah.
Just to hopefully encourage students, you talk about the plan and how you're going to do this, right?
Yeah.
And you go through, Fram had a scholarship from a certain well-known, no longer very successful company. I'll let you tell the story, Fram.
Well, yeah, so they were a very large film manufacturer based out of Rochester, New York, and I had 75% of my tuition was actually paid by them at Clarkson. And long story short, but there was a reason for this. There was a reason. They turned me down for a summer internship in my sophomore year. And when they turned me down, despite the fact I had a scholarship from them, I had to run and find an internship. And my two older brothers here said, "Hey, you should come over and consider interning in IBM Burlington." And the sole reason that I got that job, there was a hiring manager, Steve Hoffman, who was a big ham radio operator. And I, of course, was a big ham radio operator, just like my two brothers. And he simply needed someone for the summer who could solder stress racks. And he said, "I know if this guy's a ham radio operator, he certainly knows how to solder." So I spent the entire summer just soldering away, and it was very lucrative, if nothing else. On the diversification of demand. So this is another interesting one because every one of the execs I talked to this semester, I asked them kind of this question, right? Which is, with demand becoming more diversified, moving from like PCs and cell phones exclusively into these new areas like automotive and IoT and hyperscalers. Do you see the cyclicality of the industry sort of smoothing out because of the diversity, staying the same or getting worse? And it was interesting because I would have thought some people would have said, it's going to smooth out or it's going to, and most of them came back and said it's either going to stay the same. A few of them, including, by the way, Rene Haas, CEO of ARM, said it's going to get much worse.
I think it's going to get much worse.
I think so too.
One of
Decades
the
now,
things
people
that
predict it
is
getting better, and it never has. And I think the reason is, tell me if I'm wrong, Greg, but I think the reason is what happens, you chase these other segments, and now you kind of have, and you say, okay, I got to concentrate the segments I'm good at, and I bring my value. So you don't end up really any more diversified. The industry's more diversified, but you as a company,
well, that's certainly a
still have a
factor.
small
I
number.
think one of the fundamental reasons we have the high cyclicality is just the granularity of capacity. There's no such thing anymore as a small fab. So when fabs come on, you get step function increase in capacity. And
And when they empty out, you're screwed.
and as we know from accounting, depreciation is going to happen whether you produce wafers or not. And so I think the granularity of capacity is a very fundamental aspect of the that contributes to the cyclicality of the industry. I think the other factor that certainly is a reality right now is the bifurcation of the industry. The sub 7 nanometer landscape completely different than the mature node or legacy node or whatever you want to call the greater than 7 nanometer. two very different dynamics, economics. And so I think it's going to be worse in the sense that now the stakes are higher, right? We used to think 10, 15 billion was enough for a fab. Leading edge fab today producing sub 7, it's 25 billion plus. It's $1 billion for a design before it even gets to market. To design a 3 nanometer design today is $1 billion. There aren't going to be a lot of players. And, we know in the leading edge, there's only 3 companies left: TSMC, Samsung, and Intel. And Samsung and Intel, clearly have lost share. TSMC has essentially become the price maker, sub 7 nanometer. And if you look at their key leading edge customers, NVIDIA, Apple, a little bit of Qualcomm, a little bit of Marvell, there aren't many companies that can commit $1 billion on a design, and before they can recoup any revenue. I think on the legacy node side, we briefly just talked about mainland China. There are 22 300 millimeter fabs coming online in mainland China in the next 2 years. They have, because of export controls, they have targeted the mature nodes. They've said, okay, we get it. We're not allowed to buy ASML equipment and others. So we're going to bring up our industry, our domestic semiconductor industry in mainland China, using essentially mostly the 28 nanometer and above nodes. And so you have this tremendous increase globally in capacity by players who are essentially what we call GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises. So they're not going to be profit motivated. It's a planned economy. They're told you must produce. And so I think that's going to change the dynamic. So I'm in the camp of, I don't think the cyclicality goes away. I think if anything, it might get even worse.
Yeah. Hey, Geoff, I got a trivia question for you. I want to see how well you know your twin brother. What is your twin brother Greg's favorite bet at the horse track?
Oh. I think he's a daily double guy, unless he's changed. Trifecta?
No,
Joe?
I wish. The correct answer would be the exacta.
Exacta.
Okay, so now I have a question for you, Greg. On your twin, what's his favorite drink?
Martini, 3 olives.
No, the answer is anything with alcohol.
The correct answer is Scotch, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
The correct answer is Scotch. So what are we going to ask Freya? What trivia question we want Freya?
Oh,
Well, this should be easy. Ask Greg, what's Fram's favorite bet at the racetrack?
No, I'm not
that's
gonna ask
easy.
that.
Superfecta.
Superfecta. I know that one even.
Always.
For those who don't know, his real name is Michael.
Michael Ephraim.
Michael Ephraim. But no one calls
Jeffrey
him
Maroon and
Okay.
Gregory Shakradla.
Yeah.
Yeah. We it's funny because I never call him Greg. I mean, we always called him Fram. Pay him now or pay him later for those of you old enough to remember that commercial.
Yeah.
But
Well, we can quickly. So Michael comes from St. Michael's College, which is where our dad went to university in Winooski, Vermont. And Ephraim, St. Ephraim is the church in our dad's village in Kfar Debien in Lebanon. So
and also in San Diego now.
in San Diego. So Jeffrey.
So mom was an English teacher.
Okay.
I was named after Jeffrey Chaucer, which is why it's spelled Geoff. Maroon was actually our mother's maiden name, but it's really a first name in Lebanon. And it was the saint that founded the Eastern Church, the Maronites in Lebanon, that we're a part of. Greg.
Gregory, I think, was to have 2 G's for the twins. And St. Gregory. And my middle name, I'm named after my paternal grandfather. My dad's father was Shukradla, which in Arabic means thanks be to God. Thanks.
And, I guess one other story, and then we'll get back to the agenda here, which is I'll never forget, there's always alternatives. We talk about backup plans and alternatives. And the one that always pops into my head around alternatives is the story of the metal detector. Do you remember that story?
How could we
I think
forget?
you're going to tell it, Fran.
And so for the benefit of the folks on this seminar, um, I believe it was you, Greg, who really
Yes, it was.
wanted a metal detector.
Yep.
And mom and dad refused to allow him to get a metal detector. And this was right around this time, actually. It was
Yes.
right around April.
Yeah.
And so my two older brothers, this is a long time ago, I was pretty young, they came to me with this proposition and they said, "Hey, have we got a deal for you? We really want to get a metal detector. Mommy and daddy won't let us have a metal detector. So the good news is you're getting a metal detector for your
For
birthday,
your birthday.
which is end of April." And I thought, wow, that's really cool. And they said, and the other great thing about it is we're going to all split the cost. And so I'm
Yes.
like, well, wait a minute here. I don't want a metal detector, and yet I'm going to have to pay for it as part of my birthday present. And this just shows you how long ago it was. And they convinced me to actually fork over money for my own birthday present, which I didn't really want. But Greg somehow,
Now it's clear why Fram isn't the smartest one of us.
well, yeah, I guess so. And,
Good
Greg
story.
finally convinced me that we were going to find so much money and coins, the ROI, et cetera. So, yeah, it made about as much sense as Fab CapEx business cases there, Greg. So,
Yeah, it went about as
Yeah.
far as 450 millimeter.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So, let's just talk a little more on the bifurcation of the technology, right? And uh, so, you brought up two great points on some of the older technologies, right? We're we're probably heading into a period where there's going to be a glut of capacity, right?
Yes, I think the sort of the national interests, if you look at what's happening globally, you're seeing countries want to get into the semiconductor industry to establish as a matter of national security.
Mhm.
So, for example, Vietnam, India, of course, Western Europe is continuing to invest. So, what they tend to want to do is start with these mature nodes as a learning, right? As to get started. So,
Yep.
I agree. One of the things that I think is very important in our industry, we have these so-called sweep up nodes, right? These are long-lived nodes, a lot of capacity, and customers get confidence in investing design dollars to remap or redesign legacy parts into these sweep up nodes. And certainly 28 nanometer is a sweep up node. It really has brought a lot of the older 40, 50, and 65 nanometer designs down to 28.
And they'll probably stay there for a
They'll
while.
probably stay there for a very long time. But customers have to be assured that there's long-lived capacity and a
Yep.
commitment on the part of the foundries. And so with the advent of these 28 nanometer fabs in mainland China, and as I said, throughout Asia and Europe, uh, you will, I think, see, where you're going to have, I think, overcapacity because people are not getting in to meet a demand,
Mhm.
getting in to establish capability for their national interests. And I think that's the danger in the mature nodes is this because 70% of the global IC demand is in the mature nodes. I mean, the leading edge is not more than 25% or 30% of total wafer production. So countries, have a vested interest in really going after that initially.
Do you think places like India and other folks, are they mostly going after domestic?
Domestic, yeah,
They
they've
try. They
stated
try.
goals,
Yeah.
right? China's is 70%, India
Yeah.
is, 25% within I don't know how many years. So they have stated goals to for domestic
Mhm.
consumption.
Yeah.
Um, the difficulty is that again, these initial capability fabs can distort the supply demand picture at these nodes.
And I can tell you too, again, because of my experience, as you know, in different countries, I get a lot of calls about countries that want to start fab capability. And one of the difficulties is what they would really want is a fab now, today, within 6 months, because they have current demand, they have a current situation. And then when you explain to them that, this takes 2 to 3 years and money and investment and hiring engineers, and then you could start, or you've got to target the next generation, which you may not have demand for. So, for instance, internal demand for either EVs. India has a very small defense-related semiconductor. Others have some of these internal demands. Timing, if you want to have at least some base demand, because that is a good thing to do. Some people want to do it and think they're going to business from outside. But if you're going to start, you might as well start inside. But timing that and having the risk profile is a very difficult thing to line up. You have three things you need to line up. You need to line up the business case. You need to line up the capability to execute, hire engineers, build the fab, blah, blah, blah. And you need the political will, which is a big thing. And in many countries, you can't get all three of those points of the triangle at the same time.
Yeah. And I mean, overall, it's still a global supply demand
It is.
is going to
It is.
govern
Absolutely
the
is.
macro, and then tariffs and
Right.
geopolitics and other
And
stuff.
and I think that's what many politicians are learning, particularly on the leading edge here in the US, right? This whole CHIPS Act, targeting fab-based investment in the US. Well, it takes a long time. It requires substantial private money, because as large as this CHIPS Act was, it's a fraction of the necessary investment needed for leading edge.
You
Requires
guys know
ecosystem.
Right.
Support these fab projects in the United States. So it's I think it's been an eye opener for the politicians to see, because the reality is today 90% of the world's leading edge chips are manufactured in Taiwan. And if that's going to change, as Geoff indicated, it's going to require tremendous lining up of investment, political will, and attracting the talent necessary to support that in other regions of the world.
So let's
think about it like steel. Hold that thought. So think about it like steel. You build a steel mill, that steel could be used in many different places, quite easily, rather, right? But that's why they ship it in rods or whatever shape, and then somebody does something to it to use it. Fab isn't like that. Fab lasts 20, 30 years, but you got to continually invest along that time, and you better have linkage to your demand, because you can't just use that capacity for anybody, right? And that's what makes it trickier. And people, they're used to, they become more traditional. I built a car plant. I put some robots. I reprogrammed the robot. I built a different model. It's not like that. Several countries in the Middle East, of course, I'm familiar with. It's not like drilling an oil well. You go exploring, you go 200 holes, you find 120 that have oil, and you sit on them. And you wait till the price gets to the point, and you pump and make money. Fabs are not like that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to mention, let's break apart the ecosystem a little bit into some of the segments that we talked about. So first one I wanted to look at was the EDA and sort of IP segment. This is certainly an area where the U.S. clearly has good leadership on, right? But it's another area where, depending on export controls and other stuff, right? China is trying to
absolutely
heavily in.
And I think this is an area of risk for us in the sense that this decoupling from China and these export controls are accelerating the emergence of the ecosystem in mainland China.
Yeah.
Or equipment manufacturers, they're probably up now to 30% replacement with Chinese built equipment.
You can't move in Semicon China. Semicon China is 6 to 8 buildings.
Yeah.
Compare that.
In the EDA and IP front, right? One of the things that's happening is just a tremendous interest in, for example, cloud-based open source EDA, getting away from the proprietary EDA infrastructures of the past. So, I don't think you just can't overlook the hundreds of billions of dollars that the Chinese government is investing reach their goal of 70% domestic, self-sufficiency in semiconductors.
And they're
It
very
is
serious about it.
completely changing the landscape, I believe, of both primarily initially the mature nodes, but it'll only be a matter of time where they will now be as well a very viable competitor, I think, assuming there's no military takeover or something, but a very viable competitor to Taiwan at the leading edge as well.
They're very serious about it. They've had runs in the past where they put big money and the money just got wasted. But I know from my day job, they are very serious about the allocation and making sure it's used properly and in support of their goals this time, and not just, let me call it leakage. They really have become very focused on where they're spending their money, what they're getting for it, who's using it. Sometimes that gets interpreted as being against foreign companies. That's not really the case. They just have had issues, and they have budget constraints as well because of their economy. But I could tell you they are very focused on getting results.
Yeah, I mean, Huawei's just announced the last 24 hours, right? Their latest AI chip to compete
Right.
with NVIDIA. It's built at SMIC using SMIC, what they're calling a 6 nanometer process. And clearly they're kind of bending some rules and doing some double processing and some other stuff,
Absolutely.
right?
They're
To,
extending current, deep
yeah,
UV
current
immersion
capabilities.
lithography. But
But
I always, again, I'm a huge history buff. You look at history, whenever countries are embargoed
mhm,
or, export controls are placed on them, think South Africa, think Nazi Germany,
yeah,
it can lead to innovation,
mhm.
right? If you're a chemie, Fischer tropes, right? Converting coal to liquid fuel
Yeah.
was driven by these embargoed countries who were not allowed to purchase petroleum, but had coal reserves.
Best story I
Similarly,
ever heard. Best
in
story I ever heard. When I took over AMTC, which is the GlobalFoundries joint venture that makes masks in Dresden, which is the former East Germany. And I got to meet some of the guys there. And it turns out in the old days, behind the Iron Curtain, they couldn't get stuff, the export controls, whatever. These people would go to conferences and remember the old IBM stick-on buttons with the non-functional chips?
Yeah,
They would collect those and microsection them and analyze them. And that's to figure out how to make microelectronics. This guy told me he ran the lab. He goes, "Oh, yeah, I used to get all these IBM things, which my brothers are very familiar, and maybe others, and they would treat them like gold. And people say, "Oh, yeah, take a bunch for them, take all you want, right?" And they would cross section them, analyze them, and then use that to develop their microelectronics industry.
well, and just again back to the IP discussion,
Yeah.
the treatment, the IP treatment in mainland China is certainly not the same as it is in other parts of the world, and so IP is one of the hardest design IP is one of the hardest things to protect. And certainly, Qualcomm has a long history of trying, but and so I think, the net of all of this really is even with all of the barriers that the Western countries have placed on mainland China, we shouldn't underestimate the rate at which they are becoming really a major player in the semiconductor industry.
And the
yeah, and
difficulty with that.
yeah, and certainly, we have a lead and we have an advantage in things like EDA and IP and semiconductor equipment, right? But there's areas where they're much better positioned. So in areas like packaging, certainly access to some of the key raw
Rare
materials,
earth materials. I mean,
materials,
one
et
of the,
cetera,
sort
right?
of really big events, right, over the last 30 days has
Yeah,
been the export controls that China has placed on rare earth materials, which are absolutely essential to our industry.
yeah.
I think it will be a good wake-up call. I think it will help us to identify and develop alternative rare earth sourcing.
Mhm.
But I think it's really important to recognize, in the areas of robotics, battery technology. I mean, there's a whole series of industries now that mainland China is ahead of everyone else in the world. I
And
mean,
finding a way.
there's
I
a
just read an
famous
article.
interview with Tim Cook. He said, why is Apple in China?
Mhm.
Why is Apple in China? People think it's for cost. He says, well, no, that's not the main reason we're there. There are capabilities in China that don't exist elsewhere in the world in terms
Yeah.
of technical capabilities, in terms of scale. Why did we see that quick turnaround on smartphone exemptions to the tariffs?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the smartphones cannot be produced anywhere else.
We're seeing that
Smartphone
with
exports from China are 10% of total exports.
yeah. We're seeing that with EVs as well, right? I mean, BYD and the progress,
BYD is
right?
at a scale that is
Yeah.
unprecedented in terms of their ability to produce vehicles. So it's, I think we have to just recognize that they are a major economic power, and particularly in our industry, the semiconductor industry, they are an emerging powerhouse
Yeah.
that the world will have to accept and work with and compete with for future demands.
Yeah.
It's always finding another way too. I just read this article. I don't know how true it is, but there's researchers, typically rockets, hypersonic missiles particularly, are made from titanium because of the heat and etc. And stainless steel was deemed not suitable for those applications. They figured out a way to make high quality stainless steel with thermal protection barriers on it, which apparently they've already tested and it works. Much, much cheaper, much easier to produce, doesn't have a dependency on titanium supply, et cetera, et cetera. So whether that's true or not, I think it's that approach
Yeah.
that you
Very
have to look
pragmatic
for. So you
approach.
could say, well, you're never going to get a piece of titanium from us. That's all right. We're using stainless steel in these thermal barriers and we're getting the same or close, good enough result.
Well, and I think too, the age-old advantage you have is if you're manufacturing, you have the ability to learn. You learn in incremental ways that help you to develop the next generation of product. And I think that in many industries, that's where China, I think, is at an advantage, is that the scale of manufacturing that occurs in China allows them to learn. And so, I think it will be interesting, and certainly I think very much in favor of how do we get more investment in the United States such that we can regain these learning cycles, right? That we can regain the ability to manufacture at scale so that that can inform us onto improvements into the next generation, independent of industry,
Yeah.
right? That's how the best development occurs. That's how you get to these, competitive state in manufacturing. It's very hard to do stop and go manufacturing. Very hard to do low scale manufacturing. These
Yeah.
are usually very expensive, inefficient, and you don't benefit from the learning cycles that can occur when you're committed to a longer term, high, at scale manufacturing in an industry.
And it's tough too because some of this diversification of demand, you're going after markets that, highly personalized, small lot sizes, et cetera.
Yes.
And that flies in the face of what you really like to do in a semiconductor manufacturing facility, which is set up a part number and just run it
Yes.
forever,
Yes.
right?
Hit the
And
Hummers.
and then there will be
The
innovation. And there is
Hummers.
innovation occurring, but you're right, Fram. The high capex of our industry, in that unrelenting depreciation stream and let's face it, one of the things that oftentimes hinders U.S. manufacturing is what's the cost of capital? What's the required rate of return? Asia over the last, 50 years has accepted lower rates of return and has offered much lower cost of capital. That has fostered investment in Asia to build infrastructure. I mean, this didn't happen overnight, right? When Geoff and I started the industry, 35% of the world's ICs were manufactured in the United States.
Yeah.
It's now 10%.
We talk about Japan emptying out,
I
but
mean, it's
US
4
had its own.
years in the making. And so that's the kind of multi-decade commitment that, I think public policy will be needed for the US to meaningfully reestablish capabilities in these critical areas.
I mean, come on, man. When you guys started in the industry, Reagan had just become president.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
We saw him. We were in Vegas at the airport, remember?
Yeah, in Nevada, remember? Yeah.
We had a rally there
Yeah.
and we watched it before we drove to LA.
And there was much to be learned from the 80s in terms of public policy, I think industrial policy. The mistakes were made, no question.
Hairdos,
Well, okay, yeah, we won't get into that,
wardrobes,
but great music, great music.
Great
great
music. Yeah, you
music.
guys still listen to the 80s. Everyone, for sure.
But I think again, for the current administration, hopefully we can, continue the advocacy, that the companies that are in the industry continue to, use with the administration to say, look, if we're going to have industrial policy that's conducive to investment, here are some of the main elements that we'd need to see, for semiconductor investment in the United States.
Hey,
So,
Fram, as we're past 7, I want to make sure we're focusing in on the audience a little bit on the Clarkson. So any themes that came out during the year that you think we should focus in on?
I think we're covering it pretty well. I think of a couple other things that we'll get to include talking a little more about packaging and system and package, and then some of these other trends like vertical integration around design. So we'll get to that. But on the manufacturing side, right, I think one of the key sort of questions is, can the US actually compete, right? And it's more than just a cost element, right? Because you
It
can,
is, although cost is important. One of the
yeah,
things that has been interesting to see, for example, in TSMC,
yeah,
is they've been very clear. They
yeah.
will not have a global blended price.
Mhm.
And so if an Apple says, I want my 2 nanometer wafers out of Arizona, well, then you're going to pay the US price. And that US price is going to be 25% higher than the Taiwan price.
And
So
it's not just labor, right?
no,
It's
no, no, no. It's regulatory, it's
utilities.
labor,
Raw
utilities.
materials.
I mean, there's a whole host of reasons, and there's been a number of studies, public studies, that have been, put out that show that even in a highly automated semiconductor fab,
Mhm.
uh, it's still 20 to 25%, leading edge.
Yeah,
Still, it's a higher cost, as TSMC has said, and we will charge it. So I think that's going to be the public policy debate,
yeah,
particularly at the leading edge, is what's needed for national security. Okay, if so, how do we overcome this cost differential, if you will, and provides incentives, right? And this is true for all of us, right? I mean, are consumers willing to pay more for semiconductors sourced in the United States?
yeah. And I think the third element of that is what's the public policy appetite for trying to compensate for that, right?
You know,
So, are you willing to do special incentives around taxes and utilities and other stuff
you're
to,
right. You're right.
right? And by the way, if you start doing that for semiconductors, are you going to do it for electronic manufacturing? Are you going to do it for
Battery.
automakers?
It's a broad debate. It
Yeah.
actually is, it's a very important public policy debate to have is what is in the national security,
Mhm.
what is a sort of economic investment or development, industrial policy decision.
Yeah.
Because the other thing that people have to realize is the U.S. government and Department of Defense and all the customers, the entire demand of the U.S. government is less than 5%
Mhm.
of IC demand. And
Mhm.
so it's a very small, very critical need, and it's a broad range of technology need, leading edge, mature node, compound semiconductor. But it's not going to be enough typically for a company to solely supply the government. It has to be on a commercially viable platform.
But there's also, I would argue, a little bit more when you consider sort of broader infrastructure, right? In
Yes,
the US, right? So you're going to set up your high-speed networks and smart cities and kind of
there are.
all these
Absolutely.
different things.
I
Absolutely.
love seeing my two brothers become policy wonks.
Well,
But let me use the TSMC Arizona to get back to one of the original points.
Yeah.
So you're a student at Clarkson. You graduate. You probably come from New York or New England, maybe, or probably at least an area or Long Island. That was kind of the range. But let's say Northeast, right? You like to ski. You like to hike. Where are the jobs? Arizona. I just came from Arizona last week. It's incredibly hot. It's 100 degrees.
Hey,
It's
you can hike. You can hike in Arizona. You can get access to skiing.
Yeah.
You can, and you can. And that's my point. Are you willing now to go to Arizona because that's where the jobs are, right? And that's a kind of decision
Yes.
that, that's a domestic one, let's say. And right now, I would say Arizona is the only place. Texas got a little bit in terms of fabs. There's certainly hiring
New
elsewhere.
Mexico too. New Mexico
New
still.
Mexico's got a
Yeah.
little.
Yep.
New York, let's be fair, New York's got some things going on
It
as well.
does. It does.
I
And,
wouldn't call it the big growth in hiring right now.
No, but I mean, it's got
It
what
does.
what do they call it? The
the
Silicon
I-90
Yeah, the
I-90
Silicon
corridor, right?
Canal.
corridor. Yeah,
But I think
absolutely.
that's what people need to think about too. And for instance, would you be willing to go to Singapore? Now you gotta get a work permit. There's more complications there. But again, I have a part of my groups are in Singapore. Our most advanced fab is in Singapore. And there are many, many Americans working there in all kinds of things.
And by the way, they'll bounce around because,
Right.
New York may not have a lot of active stuff going now, but in 5 years, if, the Micron facility shows up in Clay and all this other stuff,
Exactly.
and you've garnered the
Absolutely.
right experience in Singapore or Arizona, right?
You're golden. You're golden. Oh, it can work. Look, if you can find something in New York, you should go for it, right? Close to home and all that. But there will come a point where maybe, you're itching, you want career growth.
Well, and the Micron's a good
Might have to
example,
look at it.
right? Their Idaho facility is hiring.
Yeah.
And if you gain experience in our industry at a facility, absolutely you're gold because it's a whole different hiring process for an experienced person than it is for an entry level role.
Boise's not bad, by the way. Boise's not bad.
Very true, very true. So let's circle back to the packaging side, because that one I think is another
Once a packaging guy, always a packaging.
what was it? Tab? Was it
Tape automated
automated
bonding.
bonding?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I went through it all. I was both ceramic and plastic. I was kind of the bridge engineer.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
very first assignment, this will really make you guys laugh, was Silgard. I don't know if you remember that, Skrilla, but
Yep. Yep.
the ceramics that IBM used for packaging gave off alpha particles. And as if those of you who are technical know, the alpha particle could disrupt the storage cell in the
Soft error rate. Soft
And
error
it's a
rate.
soft
in
error rate.
in an
Doesn't
SRAM cell.
damage it just changes the bit and you have an error. You have the wrong data, particularly in DRAMs. And that's what we were packaging. And the way to protect it they came up with was you had the ceramic substrate, and they had the chip face down with the C4s, the solder columns in between. You had to inject the silicone gel underneath to absorb the alpha rays so that it didn't affect the chip. That was my very first job. And then you had to seal the back with this green epoxy. Both these things were made by 3M, by the way, and made sure it's sealed hermetically around the anodized aluminum can that went around and put all this in, but not get on the pins so you could still put it. That's the technology of the 80s.
Well, by the way, before we dive into the packaging stuff, how many people got into engineering or technical fields because of Star Trek?
Well,
Certainly in our generation, quite a few.
Right.
I think
Right.
it was.
I'm
It all came
talking our
true.
generation, right? I mean, we grew up,
Yes.
probably the two shows we watched the most. Here's the other trivia question. Star Trek, and what's the other one?
MASH.
MASH. Of course.
Come on, man. Those aren't hard.
Don't you
Well,
remember
when you
the TV? Don't you remember we'd set up the TV trays, and if we
Yeah.
were really good,
Right.
Mom and Dad would let us eat in the TV room.
And to turn the antenna just right so you could get the Star
That's
Trek.
true. We had to turn the
Well,
antenna.
So I think though for this generation it would be sort of the follow-on Star Treks and maybe
Yeah.
Star Wars.
Uh,
Star Wars is even.
yeah.
Yeah, but
So
it's
here's
fun one to
another
make.
trivia question. Another trivia
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
What was the alternative use for the TV trays in our TV room?
Oh. That must have been you because we weren't allowed to make
know.
trouble. We were good boys.
We used to put the TV trays in front of the TV screen when we would play
Hey,
hockey.
hockey. Yeah,
hockey.
you're
That
right.
was the goal.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Don't you remember?
You
Yes.
got me there.
Yeah.
You got
I
me.
never scored though.
I
The
think
point I was gonna
success.
make, a couple
the
of
suc-
times in my career, packaging and
Yeah.
photo, you become an expert in one niche and can serve you well.
Yeah.
So I actually first ran in the 90s IBM's worldwide mask operations.
Mhm.
And I actually was like not excited about it, but it was a great job. And I kind of had a lot of fun. Semitech, we did lots of stuff. Then fast forward to GlobalFoundries, and I picked up AMTC, which was their mask operations. Now I run the world's leading photomask blank supplier. So sometimes you need to be flexible, but also trying to find some niche that you kind of ride and become an expert in a small, big fish, small pond
Mhm.
can be quite good actually. You know, Fram's like the mobile broadband consulting guru. Greg's like the reliability quality guy. And
No,
and
it's
I
very
know
true.
for a fact that people other than semiconductor people come after Greg, right? He knows about quality systems and
That's
everything
very
from
true.
consumer goods to
Real
other things.
life example. So I was at IBM Microelectronics. I was a director of quality in the early 2000s, 2000, 2001, 2. Then went back to the fab, sort of classic fab engineering. Fast forward 2014, I'm still at IBM, but working in Albany in this 450 millimeter wafer consortium. And I see a LinkedIn ad for a quality director at GlobalFoundries in Malta, New York. And so I applied and I'm interviewing for the job. And the first question they ask is, do you have any quality experience? Quality role. I said, yes. It was 10 years ago. I was a quality director at IBM. And that I think led me to be the most competitive candidate. And I was selected for the role. So I think, to echo Geoff's comment, you establish a personal brand, and that brand certainly should include, broad sort of spectrum of skills. But you also, we talk about T personality, right? Where you have broad skills, but then you have a deep technical interest and specialty that you're known for. And that can be very powerful in a career because you don't know 10, 15, 20, or in our case, 40 years into the future, what roles will be available. And so that's very good advice, I think, in terms of
By the
Especially
way, on the quality front, right? A lot of the quality process and procedures in the semiconductor industry kind of transfer over to like medical groups,
oh,
right?
oh yeah,
it's
automotive
all
and
basically the same, right? I
Automotive.
mean,
Yeah.
and I think one of the things our industry is a leader in is just the tolerances. When we talk about atomic level processing, it absolutely one of the foundational elements of the industry is the quality systems that allow you to maintain tolerances at the angstrom level, right? You can't do that unless you have a very rigorous quality system, as well as having systems that help protect customers from quality incidents. So I think you're right. It's very fungible skill to other industries.
let's talk about the AI angle. Now, I'll give you a real life example. We deal with EUV blanks, which are extremely extreme, atomic level, 50 layer sandwich of molybdenum silicide. It can't have any defects, phase or otherwise. And the metrology on this is very difficult. And so we had this issue of defects, and we said, well, let's go hire a couple, defect type engineers, process type engineers. And one of my guys came to me and said, no, no, what we really need, there's a startup, which I knew about. We need this AI thing, and we need to hire some data types who can then take all this data which we have and use AI on it. And guess what? Long story short, it was great. It just paid back in like 6 months because it was a very high value product, which we were having trouble with. So you
I
never know how it's going to be, and it might not be the other way.
Absolutely. And I would
Um,
echo what we said
right,
earlier. AI for these students that are graduating.
metrology and equipment side, you don't even have to know the process. You got to know the structures and be able to understand the requirements.
Mm.
Same for packaging. So packaging is really materials, and the materials have changed, but the problems stay the same. Thermal, conductivity,
Mechanical.
density, those fundamentals are always the same. So someone who could look at this and say, this is what we need to do. And I know if we brute force it this way, kind of like the titanium missile, it's going to be a problem. We just can't get anywhere. But I'm not going to bang my head. I'm going to try a different way. Stainless steel with heat barrier, right? Example, and go down another path. You could really, really transform things quite quickly. It could catch on. A simple little thing. Some of you guys will know who I'm talking about. This guy used to be an IBM colleague of mine, CEO now. They make essentially this thermal grease. It's like a cooling solution that puts on top of a chip. Very simple, basic material science, but it has good characteristics. It's elastic, it doesn't separate, it doesn't do it, blah, blah, blah. Startup successful, incredibly successful based on this one thing.
Yeah.
Right?
One
Not
one
everybody's
area
going to have that
I
story.
would
There's
just
lots of
mention,
failures too, but
because
just
it
as
is an emerging area, is digital twinning or simulation.
Mhm.
In our industry, whether it's a circuit,
we're not
whether it's
digital, right? We're the
materials
real
that
thing.
Geoff is mentioning, or even a fab operation, the use of simulation is very powerful as a starting point for helping to define what we want to do in terms of physical experiments. And so for students, even just learning more about digital twinning and the use of simulation, we use in our industry something called TCAD, technology, right? Computer aided design, right? There's many, of course, circuit simulation and circuit designing. We use in my group, in fact, we have a group that does materials modeling. So these are where as Geoff indicated, essentially packages are a marriage of many materials. And so you
Mhm.
want to simulate, what are the mechanical and thermal stresses that would be present. Very powerful. And so obviously a lot of that is going to, start to merge with AI in terms of AI enabled simulations, right? But again, for students, very, very powerful skill to develop is familiarity with in the use of simulation tools.
By the way, that's
We're funding a research project in Singapore at a university for trying. We want materials with certain properties, but instead of just trial and error, we're actually doing AI simulations to try to scope in on defining a material mix, a multi-element material mix that will have the properties we want before we test it.
and by the way, a lot of people when they talk about digital twins, they talk about this concept of shift left,
Yeah.
right? And the whole concept around shift left is the sooner that you can change something, change management is a big deal, right? And sooner you can do it in the development process, typically the cheaper it is and the more degrees of freedom you're going to
And the
have,
bigger
right?
impact it will have.
Yeah, bigger impact, across the
By the
board.
way, just for clarification, Geoff and I are still analog twins.
Yes.
We're
Yeah,
not digital twins.
yeah. Thank God, man. I don't know that I could have handled
But Fram's digital. He's really an AI avatar.
I it was
Yeah, yeah.
bad enough growing up. Don't you remember the watching, speaking of the 80s, you remember all the wrestling matches?
That's
Yes.
The
true.
problem was I would always lose these wrestling matches to these guys because they were a tag team and I was solo. So
But look how you turned out. Fine, right? It was part of your upbringing.
it definitely made me tougher for
Yeah.
sure. Uh, but yeah, I mean and in fact, of course, I I spent a few years at Siemens Digital Industry Software, so I'll give them a bit of a shout out here. And simulation software was a huge thing for us. And in fact, if you look back classically, the way things were designed, it was designed and then you would simulate. And now there's this whole concept of what's called simulation driven design, where you actually start with simulation. It gives you the right design point to start at and go.
And
Here's
that's where I
another
think AI enablement is going to be
Oh,
just
yeah.
so powerful. I saw this excellent video where they brought in a couple, I think two or three very senior chip designers, 20 plus years, and they showed them a completely AI designed chip.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are senior guys that have done multi generations of design. And they said, wow, I never would have thought of that. Or this is
Yeah.
so different in terms of design methodology than I would have done.
Yeah.
So it just shows you how powerful as a tool AI will be in simulation and design in many areas. And so I think for technical professionals, proficiency with AI is going to be just like for us using a calculator or learning a spreadsheet was, in the early 80s.
I think
So
closer to Matrix than Star Trek is what we're talking
yeah.
about.
By the way, Geoff, one of the most popular, bringing your point you brought up earlier, one of the most popular simulation softwares when I was at Siemens was thermal simulation.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's mechanical, there's electrical, but thermal simulation was one of the biggest because you got higher and higher performance being packed into a
It is
smaller and
unbelievable the
yeah.
power and heat gradients that are
Yeah.
these hyperscalers are driving.
And so, on the packaging front, one of the things I was going to drive in is that two things. First of all, you're seeing wafer fabs starting, chocolate in my peanut butter in my chocolate. So the very back end of the wafer fabs are starting to think more about how they do some simple packaging steps, right? And the packaging folks are thinking about how they do some basic wafer things. So those lines are blurring. The other thing is that the packages now are becoming so complex that you have to take some of these EDA tools that were used for complex SoC chip designs, and they're actually being used on
Absolutely.
system and package designs.
Because we use the term advanced packaging, but as
Yeah.
everyone here knows,
Yeah.
the three of us, it's an umbrella term.
Right.
There's just a whole host of technologies that are involved, whether it's silicon interposer, hybrid bonding, you just go down the list of all these advanced techniques. As Fram was indicating, something called RDL, redistribution layer, right? Where you transition from the interconnects that are done at the wafer processing level into larger dimension structures that are compatible with,
The outside world.
post-fab processing. And so, very exciting area, very exciting area. The U.S. government is funding major work in this area. Advanced Packaging Center being established at the Arizona State University, as well as in Texas, right? And so these are
This is the current one already in Georgia.
plus the current one in Georgia, exactly. So these are targeted, really because that is, if you were to look at the gap, U.S. versus rest of the world, packaging's the biggest gap by far.
Yeah.
Agreed. Last couple of minutes, I do want to touch on vertical integration, particularly design, because you've both brought this up a little bit, how auto manufacturers and hyperscalers like data center folks, they're starting to do their own chip designs.
Yes.
So
yeah, very important trend. And it's really to, improve profitability, right? Because there's a whole intermediary class of companies, including your former company, Qualcomm, Broadcoms of the world, fabless design, not in the OEM, not in the actual final system, and they serve as an intermediary. And so companies, of course, look for ways to improve margin and say, well, we could do it ourselves. The classic make or buy equation.
But you need scale.
You need scale, you need talent, you need to build a internal infrastructure that supports design. But more and more companies, like I said, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, GM.
But even the data center guys, the Amazon guys, the reason they do it is for the margin, but also for the competitive advantage.
Yes.
Because they don't, part of the design is understanding the requirements and what levers it. And it's sometimes hard to communicate that in a formal way to a separate company. But if you're a design team that's totally embedded, kind of like the old IBM days, frankly.
It's the advantage
You
of an
work very
IBM
interactive, very iteratively.
without
Secret
the
sauce.
cost of manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, you can differentiate, right? Because if you're picking up the same chip and same architecture as your competitor, right? I mean, yeah, you can do some things in software, but I think you brought up cost, differentiation. The third one, I think, is supply chain control, and this one was really important for the automotive folks, right? The ability for automotive companies to interact directly with foundries to ensure both security of supply and cost. I think was something that was highlighted, particularly
Prime motivation.
Yeah.
You're not
By the way,
selling
that's
a
across
$60,000 vehicle for want of a $5 or $10 chip.
Yeah.
That's after COVID and the shocks of that, it's across everything. Now, I'll give you an example. The data center guys, the big guys, actually come and visit our sites in Vietnam and Laos that make the glass blanks that then get turned into discs that get put into HDDs that then go in their data centers. That's how far back down the supply chain they're going that they're concerned about.
All right, we're out of time. But I do want some final comments, not from me. They've heard enough from me. And we're going to do this obviously with deference and respect to age. So, Jeffrey, you're going to go first with very short final comments.
Look, thank you, everybody. I'm glad that we got to do this. Good luck to everyone, whatever their endeavors are. Be flexible, know yourself, know the rules, and enjoy yourself, but be safe, happy, healthy, and prosperous. So thank you.
Great. And Greg, similarly, short.
Yes. Best wishes to all. For those undergraduate students, make good use of your 20s. Make good use of your 20s. It's a special time.
Excellent.
Invest in yourself. I echo the flexibility. Don't have a preconceived notion, I will only do this. And you'll succeed, as Clarkson grads always do. Best wishes.